che più o meno ancora vedo qualche
Good morning, everyone.
Connessione che non si è stabilizzata, ma più o meno mi pare che ci siamo, quindi
I think that we can begin.
seminario
Let us start with this webinar,
europeo internazionale,
this international webinar
organizzato
organized
dalla Società Italiana
by the Italian
Psychiatry
Society of Psychiatry and by the IPRS
nell'ambito di un progetto finanziato
in the field of a project financed by the Open Foundation entitled PsychCare, Psychiatric Services for Refugees. The title of this seminar is Mental Health of Forced Migrants. So, mental health of forced migrants is a world challenge. So we can say that these days are very sad for all of us, most especially these are days of deep concern for all of us. Days in which, unfortunately, we still see millions of people forced to leave their country. So we already know that besides the many sources of concern, fear, anxiety, suffering, we also know that we will receive, also in our country, many people who've been forced to leave their countries. Also, because we know that in Italy, there are over 200,000 people, 200,000 Ukrainians who live here. And unfortunately, this theme is really relevant today, nowadays, and it is a challenge for all of us. So let us start this day with the participation of colleagues and psychiatrists from Germany, from Belgium, Italy, of course, and also from Australia. And given the different time zone, the colleagues from Australia, they were very kind as to send a video because it was very difficult to find a right time schedule to afford to have the presence of all the speakers. But before beginning, I would like to leave the floor to Giulio Corvetti, who is a friend, director of the Department of Mental Health in Salerno. He's a friend with whom we started this path, this project. We organized several webinars and several initiatives on this theme. At the same time, we also carried out a large screening study on the mental health of forced migrants in the province of Salerno and Avellino in the south of Italy. And he is here today not only to help me co-moderate this meeting, this webinar, but also he's here to welcome all of you as representative of the Italian Society of Psychiatry. So, Giulio, over to you. Raffaele, thank you. I did all my best to be here for the opening of this initiative. I believe that this is an essential initiative because the global challenge for every country is actually what you said. This is a terrible moment, a dramatic moment. And also the problem of multiculturality and internationality really comes, it really has to oppose the idea of protecting one's country, one's borders, and nobody expected to see a war in Europe again, with all this suffering that we are observing every single day on the mass media. And we know that we will need to work in order to protect the mental health of all those who unfortunately are forced to leave their homes. So I really join and support what you said, Raffaele. And I really share absolutely what you said. And I believe that all of us who are present here really share in these ideas. Unfortunately, we have to begin this time of training with these sad words. So first of all, I apologize because Professor Massimo Di Gianantonio, who's the president of the Italian Society of Psychiatry, I am in one of the national board members, and unfortunately, Professor Di Gianantonio couldn't be here while he attended the previous webinars, and the value of this PsychCare initiative has been fully understood by the Italian Society of Psychiatry. In fact, our society intends to support and also to provide future strategies to protect mental health. This is a theme that is being developed in a different way in Italy. So while we try to use the resources that will arrive after COVID, well, even though we are not out of COVID yet, well, but we must review these services in order to organize them in a multicultural perspective. They must be fully focused on personal and social inclusion. And these services for the protection of mental health must be prepared and formed and also organized in such a way as to provide an accurate response. We already know that the interpretation, the assessment, the evaluation of psychological needs has to address many difficulties, difficulties that are related not only to misunderstandings, but also the stress that is given by the misunderstanding with the new territory in which these migrants find themselves in. Now, this meeting is an international meeting, and because this theme is not something that concerns just one nation, but we need to find a common language so that, because we, all the countries, have to join forces and we have to pull all of our resources together, because we must offer services that can include migrants, services that are accessible to all. The Italian Society of Psychiatry has always supported the IPRS's initiatives. We also worked with the local health unit that I am here representing. And the Italian Society of Psychiatry has invested also in the future perspectives. And I think that we will develop new strategies thanks to also these webinars that we have organized and that we are organizing. We believe that today's webinar is of great importance because we must listen to the different scenarios, to international realities. And we believe that this really completes the scene, sets the tone for our work. So, Raffaele, I'll leave you the floor. And I would really like to highlight that the Italian Society of Psychiatry is really interested in this theme because we want to protect the mental health of everyone, of the whole population. And we hope that these values that we promote will prevail over the values of death and war. Thank you, Giulio. I know that you and the Italian Society of Psychiatry have been very, very active, especially to support these webinars, this series of webinars. And also thank you for what you do in your department. But I think that we have to now start with the presentations. Now, as I told you, the first presentation is a video, so we will not have the pleasure and the possibility to ask questions to the Australian colleagues, but for the following speakers, we urge you to write your questions in the chat box, and we will try to always leave a few minutes to move the discussion on, because but we urge you to write your questions in the chat. So I think that I would like to ask Alessandro to show the video by Suresh Sundram and Debbie Hawking from the Department of Psychiatry of Monash University. The title of their presentation is An Australian Perspective on the Health and Moral Landscape of Detaining Asylum Seekers. As you understand, the theme already contains a theme that is not yet clear to European onlookers. That is the theme of detention of asylum seekers. I do not know whether they will also explain how the system works in Australia, but they have this specific aspect, which is the detention, that is probably something specific to the Australian system.
Hello and greetings from Melbourne, Australia. My name is Suresh Sundram. I'm the Chair and Head of Department of Psychiatry at the School of Clinical Sciences at Monash University. Firstly, can I start by thanking the organisers for inviting me to present at this important meeting, and to Professor Massimo Clarici for organising the introduction. The data that I'm going to present to you today has been data that I and my colleague and former student, Dr. Debbie Hawking, have collected over the last number of years, plus a number of other roles in which I've played. Firstly, I'll start by my disclosures. Although these disclosures are relevant, none of the organisations or agencies have had any input into the content of the presentation today. What I want to present to you is an overview of the issues relating to refugees and asylum seekers within an Australian context. I'll present some historical and background contextual information, and then move on to describing the mental health consequences in particular with reference to immigration detention. And I want to do this because in the last part of the talk, I want to share with you the implications of this with regard to policy directives both within Australia, but of increasing concern within a broader global political context. So the Australian context is relatively minor in the global scheme of displaced persons. In 2019-20, Australia offered 18,750 places to people who met refugee criteria with the UNHCR, but because of COVID, we're only able to fill just over 13,000 of those places. However, in addition to that, there are what we have termed unauthorised maritime arrivals, or depending on the political context, illegal maritime arrivals. These are people who've arrived by boat, predominantly from Indonesia, and who are currently seeking asylum within Australia. These people are not afforded refugee status, they're afforded asylum seeker visa status. And in addition to these maritime arrivals, there are in the order of about 20 to 30,000 additional arrivals who have claimed asylum but who've arrived on valid visas by aeroplane, such as tourists, students, etc. There is a subclass of people that will be the focus for much of what I talk to you about today, and these are the so-called transitory persons. These number about 4,000 people, and these people were taken from the cohort of unauthorised maritime arrivals, but rather than being processed in Australia for their refugee status, were moved to 2 offshore regional processing centres in Papua New Guinea and Nauru. Most of these people are now back in Australia. A proportion are in the US on resettlement pathways, and a small number of about 230 still remain offshore on these in these 2 countries. Anybody who's arrived by boat may only receive temporary protection, that is, they're not permitted to settle permanently in Australia, but these transitory persons are not even given or accorded that status. They simply live in a state of limbo, which I want to describe in particular with reference to their mental health consequences. Immigration detention is a key element of what I want to describe to you today. It has 2 qualities which are problematic with regards to mental health. The first is that immigration detention is indefinite and it's mandatory. That is, that everybody who arrives in an unauthorised fashion is able to be detained by the government indefinitely and mandatorily. And it is only at the minister's discretion that someone is allowed to be released from immigration detention. This began in the early 90s and has continued. There were 2 phases which are of a special note. And these occurred between 2001 to 2007, and then again in 2012, and this persists to today. And that is the offshore regional processing. That is, in essence, an outsourcing of Australia's humanitarian commitment to the Refugee Convention by transporting people who are seeking asylum to 2 other countries, that is Nauru and Papua New Guinea, where these people are housed in detention facilities for varying periods of time and then are not permitted to enter Australia. Many of you will not be familiar with either of these 2 places. The first place is Nauru. Nauru is this island. It's about a circumference of 25 kilometres. It's a tiny Pacific island nation where the centre component of it is inhospitable because it's been mined for phosphate and people are only able to live on the periphery. A population of about 8,000 to 10,000 people live on Nauru, and although they are proud and kind and hospitable people, it is not a place for large numbers of asylum seekers. It is here in the Pacific Ocean. The other centre was placed on Manus Island. Manus Island is the northernmost territory within Papua New Guinea, which is the country that you can see just below it. It is a long distance from Australia, and as a consequence of that, it's also impossible for people who are placed in the Manus Island Detention Centre to make their way to Australia except with the assistance of authorities. These are the sorts of conditions that people were housed in. This is a child here that you can see in front of one of the detention facilities, people and children in front of another, and this is the Manus Island facility. Part of the reason for these remote locations is that it's almost impossible to then understand what is happening to people who are in these places, and so the amount of data that's available is very limited. I've been permitted both by the Australian government and invited by the UNHCR and the Papua New Guinean government to visit both centres, and from that have emerged the only literature to date that has been published on these cohorts. The first and probably the most startling was a report that I wrote for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which was so startling, and I'll present this data to you in a moment, that the regional representative of UNHCR had the contents of the report read into Hansard so that it could become publicly available. We've subsequently published 2 papers, one in the Lancet and one which has just come out in conjunction with Sandra Passadi, who is a postdoc in Zurich, Switzerland, with Nasser Marina. in the European Journal of Psychotraumatology on the conditions in Nauru. The reason that this first UNHCR report was read into Hansard, which is the parliamentary records, was because when we surveyed approximately 20% of the population on Nauru, this refers to Papua New Guinea and the Manus Island Regional Processing Centre. We surveyed about 20% of the population that were detained, which was approximately 180 were surveyed out of 900. We found extraordinary rates of mental disorder. About 79% of people met criteria for diagnosis of PTSD, about 88% for either depressive or anxiety disorder, and overall about 93% of the total sample met criteria for one or both disorders, as I said, amongst the highest rates that have been described in the literature. In Nauru, we've been able to access publicly available data, and so I'm quoting here, in fact, data that was looked at by Rowan Borshman and colleagues at Melbourne University. They documented a self-harm rate which was 200 times the mainstream population in Australia, which approximated 260 episodes of self-harm per 1,000 asylum seekers. There have been to date 9 suicides, which have included self-immolation, and here I'm showing you data relating, or an image relating to a syndrome that was observed in children after about 4 years of detention, which then resulted in the transfer of all children and families from Nauru to mainland Australia, because there was a high risk that children would die. The sorts of impacts that have been described by the cohort that were on Nauru, and this is in that paper that I've just referenced by Sandra Pasadi and our team. This is a quote: "In my country, they torture your body, but in Australia, they kill your mind." This refers to the psychological constructs which have led to the catastrophic mental health outcomes, such as disempowerment, violation, loss of self-agency, helplessness, high levels of resentment and frustration, rage, which has resulted, I think, in a lot of this deliberate self-harming and in the suicides, sadness, despair, desperation, despondency, and ultimately disengagement from all processes and family structures. People feel that they've been irreparably damaged with a deep sense of loss from the violation and trauma and from the wasted years, which now is getting close to 9 years for many people. They are plagued with highly traumatic memories. And they've described it as this: if you don't want to give me a life, okay, kill me and shoot me and I'll die one time. Why are you killing my brain? Why are you cutting my heart every single day? When somebody uses a knife and you die, and when somebody kills you every single day, kill your brain and your mind, it's totally different. It's better you die one time. There is also this element of betrayal, betrayal by institutions, betrayal by authorities, betrayal and disillusionment with a person's social and moral beliefs. And I'll come back to this at the end. The experience that many people have described to me and to others is one of being excluded, of not being accorded the value of being treated as a human, and of being rejected or expelled from the common humanity of social and communal groups. The current factors which are operating continue to be this protracted, indefinite uncertainty. As I said, there is no prospect for these people to be resettled in Australia, so they are left in limbo, and they are left with the threat of being refoulled to their country of origin. There is the persistent threat of being returned to locked detention, which has happened on a handful of cases. There is also the terrifying and awful prospect of no family reunification. So we have parents who have not seen their children in 8 or 9 years. We've had fathers who have only seen their child as a baby, or sometimes never having seen their child, and their child is now 8 or 9 years old. They are unable to work, and they have no right to work. They are unable to use any of their skills, and so their skills that they may have brought with them have atrophied. They are also unable for many people to engage in tertiary education or vocational training, and this is especially painful for children who've come and now finished high school, but then are left with no prospect of being able to undertake tertiary or vocational education. They're not permitted to enter English language classes. There's no attempt at cultural familiarisation, so they live in an excluded context within the Australian society if they're not in detention. The detention in which they do find themselves often specifies their accommodation and schooling. It limits their travel rights and freedom of movement. It includes curfews, and they're only given a minimal allowance to live on. For adults, this results in post-traumatic stress disorder and major depression in the way that I've described, suicidality, which is unfortunately increasing, and with the decay and crumbling of hope as it persists for this duration of time, we see the failure of marriages and relationships and an increase in family violence and an indifference both to health and the loss of faith. People develop in more severe forms of paranoid persecutory psychosis, and I think there are irreparable loss of functioning, both with respect to skills and to health. I'm particularly concerned also about the intergenerational transmission of trauma to children. For children, we see high levels of anxiety. In fact, I would say catastrophic levels of anxiety. We see major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, of course, culturally manifest in different ways. This is in things such as separation anxiety, school refusal, enuresis and encopresis, disrupted sleep and nightmares, insomnia, night terrors. We see very considerably disrupted attachment because of the significant parental mental illness that I've described before, but also because parents have had agency taken away from them by the institutional processes, and so they are unable to parent properly. We see this result in things such as oppositional behaviour, attentional difficulties, and screen-based numbing. We have seen learning delays, especially expressive language delay, which might be predicted with very slow and at times appears to be indefinite delays, which have not been able to be made up. Suicidal ideation and intent and occasional attempts have become increasingly prevalent. And I showed you that image before where we've seen food and fluid refusal, and children then were ultimately requiring transfer to Australia for refeeding. As I've mentioned, children who've now graduated from high school have no educational or vocational opportunities, and that engenders despair for them. There's also impaired socialisation, in particular with reference to adolescents who are unable to engage in normal peer relationships. We've done a number of things. I established a service in conjunction with Cabrini Sisters, a Catholic charity based out of New York, in Melbourne, Australia, where we established a new service to look after the mental health and primary care of asylum seekers. And with Dr. Hocking, we developed, she developed a new tool called the StarMH, which is used for screening of mental health problems. This is very important because it can be used by non-clinical and non-mental health staff in their work with patients, asylum seekers and refugees, because these disorders are unrecognised. It's very simple to use, taking only about 5 to 6 minutes, and it has very high sensitivity. So it's designed to screen people if they have a disorder, then, or potential disorder, for them then to be referred to healthcare services for a full evaluation, where, of course, again, we found very high rates of mental illness. The policy implications I want to come to, because there are a number of countries which are considering the sorts of policies that have been implemented in Australia for some years. These have included, of most concern now, the UK, but also Hungary, Denmark, and others, in particular with reference to offshore regional processing and indefinite mandatory detention. This is a disastrous policy and will have disastrous consequences for the people involved if it is finalised and implemented. There have been other components of the current Australian policy which have been effective in preventing boat arrivals. I won't discuss them in detail, but the other elements I think have been much more important. The consequences, though, for the society in which it is enacted is that it creates a class of person that is not accorded the same status as mainstream citizens or mainstream residents. This status of other is really as an alien, and that alien is not afforded the rights which would be considered common human rights. I think this has significant social impact. It creates an other, and the othering of refugees and asylum seekers removes them from sight. That's been through the detention process I've described, the remoteness of the detention process, that these people are numbered, communication with the outside world is minimized, as is media contact, and they are also placed outside the mainstream legal framework. I think through this alienation, it becomes permissible for injustice to occur, and injustice has occurred. It's detailed in the paper that I described that Sandra Passadi is the lead author. And because social inclusion is prohibited, there is a risk that their humanity is reduced, that they no longer needed to be accorded the same moral values as an included member of society. And I think that this blurring between nation state identity and human identity, by naming people as either within society because you're Australian, or you're outside this society because you are an asylum seeker, creates a challenge which transcends what I would term, or over supersedes what I might term a basic concept of humanity. So to conclude, national policies focused on deterring asylum seekers based on principles of exclusion through the use of indefinite mandatory detention, offshore processing, and prohibition of resettlement have profound impacts on affected individuals and the host community. The individual impacts are devastating, with mental disorders and corrosion of personal moral structures. And I think also the impact on society degrades human rights and consciously allows nation state identity to replace humanity as the core defining notion of the individual. So I'll finish there by thanking the people that have contributed to the research, that is the asylum seekers and their families, and all the supporting agencies in this work. Thank you.
Grazie agli amici australiani.
Thanks to the Australian friends, even though they cannot hear our thankings. I have to say that we started maybe in the toughest way, with all its nuances, because I would say that this condition of detention, and most of all the impact of these conditions on the mental health of migrants are terrifying. So I think that Sandra has reported a devastating impact on the psyche of these migrants was very important, and on the whole society that is hosting these persons. So the inevitable impact on the moral values also of the hosting society. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Ingo Schäfer. I've tried to pronounce his name properly, of the University of Hamburg. Is going to talk about escaping the process of surviving the present, youth problems in refugee populations, so surviving in the present, problems related with the use of substances in the refugee population. Let me thank Professor Schäfer for being with us. I'll leave him the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bracalenti, also for the kind invitation to be part of this event. It is a great honor and pleasure. And I might actually come from an institute that is to some extent similar to IPRS, the Institute of Interdisciplinary Addiction Research in Hamburg, an institute with a strong focus on social sciences research. And I'm also a clinical psychiatrist at the University of Hamburg, dealing with trauma and substance abuse. And in my talk, both perspectives will come together. Let me give you a short overview. In the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to give you an impression what we know about substance use in refugee populations. Also about the risk factors, which perspectives might be important. This is, of course, interesting because it might lead us to effective interventions. What are the risk factors that might characterize the groups we have to address? And finally, I'll try to come to some implications for services with a focus, I have to say, on high-income countries. This is our perspective, I would say. We try to build up services in the European countries for the refugees that come here. But we can also learn from low and middle income countries. I'll get back to that in a minute. Let me start with what we know. And the first answer is not much. Especially when it comes to the high-income countries, there is a significant lack of knowledge on substance use problems in forced migrants, very few studies. And you can get an impression of this by this recent scoping review. A group of people that had a look on 92 systematic reviews on risk behaviors in disadvantaged groups, refugees or asylum seekers, but also other groups. And the first result was that there are very few reviews from high-income countries focusing specifically on refugees or asylum seekers. And there are few reviews on alcohol use in general in any of these disadvantaged groups. So that led them to the conclusion that we know little about the barriers and facilitators in specific groups like refugees and about the individual risk factors. This is a bit different for low and middle income countries. This is an important review by Horinyak and colleagues from 2016, and they reviewed 63 studies of substance use problems among forced migrants around the world. Most of them, however, were of quite low quality. They found only 10 studies of high quality, and most of those studies focused on hazardous alcohol use. There is virtually no evidence on other substances. It's mainly about alcohol, and it's about mild and moderate alcohol problems, hazardous use. The figures of these mild problems, you could say, are nevertheless alarmingly high. In refugee camps around the world, they found figures of 17 to 36%. And what is interesting is that those figures tend to drop when people get resettled, when they come to community settings. So this is a quite consistent effect. And the risk factors they found in these high quality studies were male gender, that's a general risk factor for substance use, but also, not very surprising, mental health problems, exposure to traumatic events. That seems to predispose people to substance use. What all of us would, of course, intuitively say that's a risk factor. They also provided an overview of studies on alcohol dependence. So this is more severe problems. And there's mainly one study that might be interesting in this context, a study from Canada that included Iraqi, Iranian, and Afghan refugees, which would be pretty much the profile we have in Germany, together with Syrian people, of course. And the rate of alcohol use disorders in this group in Canada was 5%, which is not so low. It would be over the base rate of the general population. And this is not completely in line with what other studies tell us. Usually they tell us that in refugee and migrant groups, substance use problems are lower than in the host country. Or yeah, this study from Sweden, for instance, a nationwide cohort of people from the Middle East, from sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, was compared to Swedish-born people. And what they found was that in Swedish-born people, the rate of any substance use disorder was 3.5%, and in refugees, it was 1.3. So this is also a general tendency across studies that refugees have rather low figures across the whole population, you have to say. When people had come to Sweden before they were 6 years of age, they had similar rates to the people born in Sweden. The same was true when they had stayed at least 10 years in Sweden. So people come to the same pattern if they stay in the country for a longer time, which is also quite important, I think, for our contexts, because we can, when we have many refugees coming to our countries in the last years, we, you could say, have to wait for the next years, but then we will probably see effects. Also interesting, there was a relationship between PTSD and substance use disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorder was 5 times more common in refugees. Again, we see this risk factor, trauma and trauma disorders. Another study from Scandinavia, Finland, a similar setup. Different groups of migrants from Russia, from Somalia, from Kurdistan were compared to the Finnish general population. Again, what they found is that binge drinking in this case was less prevalent among the migrant groups than in the general Finnish population. In the Finnish population, binge drinking was 87%. That binge drinking means 6 or more alcoholic beverages at one occasion. That's the definition. And it had to be about once a month, or could also have been more rare than that, but that's binge drinking. And 87% of men and 72% of women reported binge drinking in Finland, which is quite impressive. And you can see that the figures were markedly lower among all migrant groups. There were general risk factors again, younger age, employment status associated with binge drinking, also among migrants, but in general, figures were lower again. I show you this study, this specific study, because we have a very interesting other study here from the same authors that was published 1 year later. And they used, I would say, the same data. I haven't had a look close enough to be sure of that, but I would say it's the same sample, more or less. Again, Russian migrants and Kurdish migrants, but now they had a look on pre-migration traumatic experiences. So they no longer report on the whole group of refugees. They take into account traumatic experiences. And all of a sudden, there are marked differences among Kurds. Pre-migration traumatic experiences were indeed associated with binge drinking, as was perceived discrimination with cannabis use, and also among the Russian migrants, pre-migration traumatic experiences were associated with cannabis use. So the message of this probably is, if we look on the whole migrant population, the figures might be lower, but if we take risk factors into consideration, we of course find groups with elevated risk. Another perspective on the consequences of substance use, an interesting study from Switzerland, emergency department admissions because of alcohol or mixed intoxications. And there indeed was an increased risk for asylum seekers to be admitted for such intoxications. They also had a higher rate of injuries when they were admitted, had to be hospitalized more often, and also interestingly had lower rates of chronic use. So this seems to point to another risk group that is vulnerable to too much alcohol consumption that leads to certain consequences and maybe out of the specific situation they are in. So lower rates of chronic use, it seems to be related to their current living situation. Actually, can such patterns differ So that's where I stress this current situation. They can differ across the trajectories of displacement. This is an interesting study among the population of Karen from Myanmar, Burma. And these people were protected. That's what they reported in qualitative interviews, that they were protected when they were in their home country from harmful alcohol use because of the cultural structures. But if they moved to Thailand, where they came to camps, refugee camps, alcohol use and related problems significantly increased. This is well documented, huge problems in this population when they were in Thailand. And when they were resettled in the United States, there were two groups actually. One group where alcohol use dropped again because it was simply not compatible with their new achievements, with their job situation, the housing, the driving privileges. But there was also another group where the opposite was the case, where there was a further increase due to resettlement stress, loss of roles, and where all this led to more severe consequences. So we have to take a very differentiated look on potential subgroups also of migrants in their respective context and what and the impact that has on substance use patterns. Sometimes they can also intensify. There are different examples like cut users from Somalia, where the use was integrated into their daily routines. And when people came to Europe, that had a tendency to change. So the use patterns weren't the same anymore, sometimes because of the supply. So they had to wait, they received the leaves, you had to chew these leaves, they received them later in the day, they used them for a longer period of time. It wasn't in the traditional context that might have been work or other daily activities. It was more a recreational use that did not lead to social consequences necessarily, because people often didn't have jobs, so they could use throughout the night, but it led to severe physical complications. So there's an aggravation and intensification of use patterns. A similar situation in opium users from Iran. You might know examples in your country. That's, I think, a quite frequent phenomenon. After people migrate to Europe, their traditional practices have to be adapted to the local market conditions. And in most European countries, or in all probably, heroin is more easily available than opium. So it happens more or less the same thing as in the opioid crisis in the United States in the last decade. So people are especially vulnerable to become heroin users. Again, an intensification of their use pattern. And this last example was also observed in a recent study we did among people in low threshold services. So these are services that take care of opiate addicts mainly. Sometimes people are also using other substances, but mainly opioids in 5 larger cities in Germany. And we could perform interviews with 128 people. All of them were male. That's an interesting phenomenon. No females that at least were willing to participate in the interviews. And we found this different histories of use. There were about half of the people that had a regular use already in the country of origin. Not all of them would have used heroin though. 20% had only an occasional consumption of alcohol and cannabis, but not of opioids. So their use pattern changed again. And 27% had no consumption at all, according to what they said. So there are different risk groups that we have to keep in mind. Talking about risk factors, what do we know? Of course, the general risk factors for substance use are also valid for refugee populations. Male gender, low education, low socioeconomic status, being single, being a young adult, all that has been reported in studies among refugee populations around the world. But there are also a number of specific risk factors that come on top of this. First of all, the availability of the substances in the host country. We all know that most European countries are alcohol cultures, so alcohol is available everywhere. That can also be true for other substances like cannabis, which in many countries is not so available. That plays a role. Then, as already mentioned, of course, mental health problems, namely trauma-related symptoms, then the loss of roles, reduced social networks, the loss of resources, acculturation, stress and discrimination experiences, and finally, the fact that refugees also tend to have a lower service use. So people can't get easily access to services, as most of you know, but they also have a tendency not to go to services because of stigma issues. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's mainly qualitative research on such barriers. A number of interesting studies, this one from Australia, again, Horignac, and among young African refugee people that used alcohol from street settings. And the key motivations they reported for drinking in this qualitative study was coping with trauma again, but also coping with the present, of course, with boredom, with the experience of social exclusion, or to say it in a more positive way, it helped them to get some positive social experiences. Quite interesting also the strategies they reported for managing drinking, the official ways like going to counseling or detoxification programs, but also sometimes intentionally committing crimes to get to prison and to be in a situation where they get clean for some time. Let me just talk about this point for 1 minute. The keyword is self-medication, and we have really a wealth of studies on the self-medication of PTSD and other mental disorders with substances. It's a very strong evidence base. There are studies on consumption motives from people with PTSD, on the temporal order of the respective disorders, also more experimental studies. So it's completely clear that we have these effects. We have less studies, though, from other cultural contexts. And this is just one example I want to give you, that it's from a camp setting in Uganda, where they, again, I will not go into details here, but they found the same effects, that alcohol use in this case was related to symptoms of post-traumatic disorders. So then if we plan interventions for refugee populations, also in our countries, it's quite clear that at least for a significant subgroup, we have to keep in mind this functionality. We have to consider it when we design and implement services. One last point, again, a qualitative study we did in Syrian refugees, 5 focus groups with Syrian people on substance abuse issues. Again, this theme of substances being more easily available, on deferring social norms, from escaping the past. But the point I want to make here is that the topic of stigma and shame related to help seeking was also one of the most prevalent topics in these discussions. And this would be a quote or 2 quotes generally, that when you say I need psychosocial support or treatment for something, and people say, oh, he's crazy, either way, it's such a shame. So it's a quite obvious point, but I think we really have to find answers to that when we think of effective ways to reach people, because it will be even harder for some populations to seek help because of these issues. And that's the bridge to the last part of the talk, the implications for services. And there's one quite interesting review that has been commissioned by UNHCR and has been done by this group, Kane and Green. They have done very seminal work in the last years on this question. And this is mainly on low and middle income countries, because we do not have any evidence on interventions in high income countries for substance abuse and refugees. I might not know all of the studies, of course, maybe there are one or two, but in the last years, we were not able to identify any studies. It's a bit different in low and middle income countries, but even in these contexts, they found only 6 studies in refugee populations, 3 that used or examined brief indicated prevention interventions, 2 multi-component community-based treatment programs, and 1 outreach study. And what they all had in common, I'd say it in a minute, that's different if they had a look on other disadvantaged populations in low and middle income countries, more studies from these populations. And that's interesting because there are some parallels at least. Nevertheless, the majority of studies did not really include evaluations, very weak designs, and again, they focused mainly on mild and subthreshold alcohol use disorders. There is a huge lack of evidence on other substances and on more severe problems, but at least some preliminary evidence from all these studies on the effectiveness on selective prevention. So groups that are at increased risk in non-refugees populations, and indicated prevention. So this would be groups that already show signs and symptoms of alcohol use disorders. But the strongest evidence is on the selective prevention in the non-refugee populations. So a huge knowledge gap. The recommendations they give, I tried to extract those that might be interesting for high-income countries like our countries. What we can already do is to adapt and implement the existing community-based and peer-delivered interventions for use in camp settings. Adaptation, of course, means cultural adaptation, and maybe also adaptation with regard to some strategies to access people, to reach people. That's why peer delivery is so important also, and to test the effectiveness of brief interventions. When it comes to mild and subthreshold alcohol problems, what we should do is to invest more into interventions for moderate to severe substance use disorders and comorbidities, and in interventions for substances other than alcohol. There's virtually nothing at present on these 2 questions. And in a recent project that we got funded from the German Ministry of Education and Research, we tried to address at least some of these gaps. If you look in the middle, we do have 2 trials here, one on indicated prevention led by Professor Klein in Cologne, and one that we are leading in Hamburg on this more severe and comorbid populations. And I'll go to that. The project on indicated prevention is using a special app, and it's also available in English and of course in Arabic and Farsi. So it could be interesting also for you. You can find it in the internet, in the Google Play Store. And it's currently under examination in a trial. And the project we're doing in Hamburg is on a group format for traumatized people with substance use disorders. And it's basically a skill training, 10 sessions with 6 to 8 participants, with interpreters. And it's a larger RCT. We were initially planning to include 267 male participants in 5 metropolitan regions in Germany. But with Corona, we ran into some problems. We have to see if we can catch up in the next months and years. Taken together, we have more open questions than answers. There are also some structural problems. How do we get access to target groups? Who's paying for the interventions? Who's paying for the interpreters? And do we have enough of them? Are our people, the staff in the agencies, are they comfortable with working with refugee populations? What do they have to learn? What kind of support do they need? And of course, it's the problems of the people themselves with their often very insecure living conditions when it comes to residential status, to housing, and much more.
Professor Schäfer, can you say in 1 minute?
Yes. It's almost the last slide. And you can find suggestions on that in a couple of European studies. I will not go into details here, but it's about outreach, it's about coordinating services, things that are quite evident but difficult to achieve. And let me come to my short conclusion. We still have a lack of knowledge, especially in high-income countries. What can we do? We need to have a differentiated view on substance use problems. It's about different risk groups. And a very consistent factor, of course, are mental health problems. And we have to keep that in mind when we build models. We can use what is already existing, brief preventive interventions, but we have to focus more on severe problems in comorbidity, and we have to find solutions for structural barriers. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you so much. I think that the data you have reported with all these studies and the analysis of the problems that are related with substances abuses, well, I think that many of the patterns that I've mentioned are absolutely implementable and transferable also in the Italian system, as we have known it, in terms of the complexity of integration interventions. And so the current situation, as I said, is an important factor, and also stress-related factors, self-medication, and also the difficulties to activate services as for the cultural barriers, the use of interpreters, access to services, as you said, and difficulties of the operators to feel that they are suitably empowered to manage the relations with the migrants. So I believe we have many things in common, also as regards the outcome of the intervention we did with PsychCare. But now I would like to leave the floor to Giulio Colivetti, who's going to introduce the next speaker. Thank you so much, Professor, for your interesting speech. Thank you. The debate is very interesting.
I have the honor to introduce a dear friend and a colleague. And we started together, and also we made our first work experiences together. I also was very happy to see his first experiences of transcultural psychology. Well, we were very young back then, and we traveled the world at the time. Today, he works at the University of Turin. He is Professor Roberto Beneduce, and he will address the theme. He will talk to us about the theme, the organization and fabrication of subjectivity. To understand the role of psychiatry vis-a-vis asylum seekers. So the point is we should govern the passage between psychiatry to mental health. In a way, we should anticipate the evolution and the stabilization of some psychological problems that we can address in a more holistic way, not simply by administering drugs or a psychiatric therapy. So, Roberto, over to you. Thank you for your presence here today. Giulio, I have to say that we had seen him before, but I cannot see him anymore. I do not know whether he has some connection problems. Because I think that he disconnected for some reason. All right then, so probably while we wait, I would like to ask a question to Professor Schaefer, or well, if you do have a question, please go on. Well, he's available to take questions. I would like to ask him, can technologies, e-mental health technologies be applied, and are they applied in your country? And are they used with regards to different forms of addictions? Also, do you believe that these technological innovations may support us in interpreting the cases that we come to terms with, but do you think that these technologies can help us provide adequate responses? So do these technologies help us diagnose these problems, but do you think that they can also help us provide the right answers? I would like to know if you have any opinion about this, but also if you have any experience about this.
Yes, I think that they can indeed be a good part of the whole package. So they can be a valuable instrument. And it's the Be Prepared app that I just showed you is along these lines, that we can use technologies to more easily access people. It could help to for this shame problem, so people don't, it could also help for this outreach necessity, so people don't have to go to services, they're more easily reached, they can do it for their own. At the same moment, there are some problems with that, because people often in the camps, for instance, in the shelters, at least in Germany, it's not so easy to use technologies. So there's no stable internet sometimes, people don't have privacy. So I think they can be a valuable instrument, but they will not be the only solution.
Thank you very much. Grazie, grazie.
Thank you. Why don't we try to move on to Renaud Branquer, and we will try to get in touch with Roberto to see what happened. All right, very well. So I will introduce Renaud Branquer. He works in Brussels. He has a great experience on the theme of the most vulnerable among the vulnerable. So he has he's an expert on those factors that make people vulnerable, factors such as stigma, stigmatization, or other components that can be found in the receiving territory. So it is my pleasure to give the floor to Renaud Branquer, and he will talk to us about his 20-year-old experience. Thank you. I first of all wish to thank the Psychoanalytic Institute for Social Research and all those who have contributed, and also the Italian Society of Psychiatry, and all those who contributed to the organization of this seminar. So thank you for inviting me. I would also like to thank my colleague, Pauline Monoval, who translated and summarized most of the previous speeches in the previous seminars, and who enabled me to focus my speech on the essential points that I am going to address. So thinking about it, we thought that it would be interesting to illustrate all the previous comments that we presented. And we will also offer a specific institutional illustration. So we will present a study of over 20 years that helped us find some key factors. So the idea is not so much to provide an exemplary model of care, but rather the possible care systems for people in exile. So in a very specific circumstances that are shaking Europe and its states, this is given by the aggression against Ukraine, well, we cannot forget the various crises that the world went through over the past 20 years and the migratory waves that resulted from this. While there are encouraging signs and promises of welcome to help the Ukrainians in exile, and we of course applaud all of these, let us remember that this did not happen for many other armed or unarmed conflicts or other political situations which have sometimes not had the honor of our media. So every day we try to heal the fear of others among our patients. Europe and its various nations treated their fears, and also we saw that Australia is doing the same. Australia tries to address these fears, these senses of guilt through objective or objectifying procedures that need to establish the truth with regards to the criteria of the Geneva Convention. ULIS, our mental health service, was born from the observation that there is no mental health provision. There is very little access to care for this population that is present in Europe. And this population is made invisible. However, they are the survivors of forced exile, a service that had to be specifically dedicated to them and which instead is still very precarious. The association ULIS was established in 2001 and was inspired by institutional therapy following the experience of Alain Van Wetteren, his founder and director, and he had this experience of a care model that comes from institutional psychiatry, and this type of psychiatry was addressed to drug addicts or psychotic patients. In the case of Ulysses, its object and purpose is to set up and promote all types of actions likely to facilitate access to mental health care for exiled people, whatever the reasons for their exile. Information, formation, and the supervision of teams aimed at making them aware of the specificities of the target public and the particular type of suffering of the latter are also part of the mission of Ulysses. So in practice, what does it mean? Now, our approach aims to open up the doors of a professionalized form of psychological support to people who have neither the means nor the idea to resort to our services. For these people, although their needs are enormous, although they really express a request that is not so self-evident, given a series of reasons, material, socioeconomic, cultural, linguistic, or even contextual reasons. So we believe that there is the possibility to create a therapeutic space for this target group. So we developed a framework that specifically bears in mind the specificities of exiled people. So we resorted to professional interpreters. There is also a flexibility that we apply. There is also the possibility to process the request very quickly. So we try to manage the problem, from a holistic approach, and there is also an effort to network. Now, Ulysses offers free of charge services, and the interpreters apologize, but there are some participants who have the microphones on, so please switch off your microphones. So the services are open and welcome patients throughout the week. And we also offer specific psychological support. And besides the clinical activities, the service offers its patients also a community component in the form of group activities, workshops, and trainings. Our specialists in mental health wanted to get knowledge of the legal framework in terms of the rights of foreign people, but also they wanted to get a knowledge of the various cultural and geopolitical issues of the cases that they handle. And they also try to identify cases of psychopathology developed in the context of Israel. Our service offers professionals specific training sessions, supervision, advice, reflection on the specificities of psychological disorders which can be identified among exiled persons. So let me share with you some figures, simply to explain our reality. So we have 23 employees in our services. This means they are full-time employees. We provide individual interviews. In 2020, we received 211 new applications for care. So these are new patients. If we compare these figures with the figures of the previous years, we can see that there has been an increase of applications. That is why our team decided to offer also some screening interviews. So there is one first interview in which we establish together with the patient, for instance, where they come from, what their current difficulties are, who their lawyer is, what their current situation is, and then we have an individual interview and then an interview with the team so that we can develop a strategy to support the person. Now, 60% of our new patients received the first interview within 2 weeks of their initial request, and 80% of patients started a month after their first contact. So who are our patients? We have many young people, and in general, we have around 40% of our patients. No, sorry, a third of them are women with regards to the age groups. 36% was aged between 18 and 30. This was back in 2020. A third of the patients was aged between 31 and 40, and 20% between 41 and 50. The other percentages have to do with older people. So most of our patients, around 60% of our patients, is aged between 18 and 40. What about their status? Most of them are patients who are illegally present on the territory. 15% of them. No, sorry, only 35% of them are not asylum seekers. With regards to the file active, we have a total of 332 people. All the people that have been cared for, not only new people. So this is the active file. So we have 332 people that we care for around every year. 69% of patients have consulted the service for less than 3 years. And 70% of the patients are quite recent and come from Africa, whereas only 15% are have been followed for over 7 years. We have patients coming from 59 different countries. 70% of them are originally from Africa. So there is a huge amount of people, a huge percentage of people that suffer from specific disorders. 89% of patients also have problems for what they went through before they became asylum seekers. 53% of them show clear signs of a post-traumatic stress syndrome. Now, with regards to the attendance, we have 4,070 psychiatric or psychotherapeutic appointments that were scheduled in 2020, and 3,182 that were actual consultations. The attendance, the frequency of follow-ups, well, in general, let's say every couple of weeks we have a follow-up meeting, so it means twice a month. whereas it is once a month for around 10% of our patients, whereas for the others we have a higher follow-up frequency. So normally we see patients once every couple of weeks. We also need to know that among our patients, we also offer mobile unit services. This means that some of our patients are followed by other therapists who go to, I don't know, their general practitioners, they go to hospitals, and they somehow offer services, also legal services, to help migrants with their their stay permits. So we also use interpreters, and we have seen that there is a huge advantage, the fact of having interpreters who are multi-language, especially who speak African languages, Russian, or also Malankay, Susu, African languages in general. So it is really important. So we have external professionals. We have an agency that is located in Brussels, and they help us not only find interpreters, but also to carry out any training session. So we have a regular contact with this agency. The use of interpreters takes place, especially in 1/4 of the interviews, whereas we use internal interpreters in about 10% of the interviews. We also have some therapists who speak French, Portuguese, Spanish, English, and other languages. So what can we say about the specific causes of psychological suffering that we find in our patients? Well, I would like to highlight some of the causes. Now, 48% of our patients had an experience of torture, 27% survived several forms of sexual violence, forced prostitution, and so on. 29% of them were victims of genital mutilations, forced marriage, and 38% of them, and 8% of them had an experience of exile as unaccompanied minors. 7% were persecuted for their sexual orientation, and there was some 30% of the patients were experienced intrafamily violence, and 8% of our patients had physical health problems. Now, we have some data dating back to 2009, and we know that these services already started to use some psychiatrists, and we have to say that 35% of the people of our patients had a psychiatric follow-up. Now, of the 116 psychiatric follow-ups that we had in 2020, 89 situations were followed up internally, that is 77% of the total number of follow-ups, while the rest was followed by other centers with which we cooperate. Now, we know that our centers use more frequently interpreters than other psychotherapeutic services. With regards, we have to do with patients who suffer from several psychiatric disorders, and therefore it is very difficult to manage the space and time for these patients. Now, I would like to get not so much to my conclusions, but rather I would like to focus on what we should learn from all these data, because otherwise I will not stick to the time given to me, because there will be so much to say. So what is at the basis of this project. Why is this project so relevant? So I would like to recall several ideas. I think that the operational aspect of this service is individual commitment, the personal commitment of all the operators, of all the professionals. It is a service that is also supported by the civil society. And so we, of course, we know that the history of humanity is a history of exile. And so what matters is an individual commitment that is supported by the whole team at the clinical but also political level. And this uses all the creativity to help our patients, to bring them out of isolation and silence, and to help them rediscover and recover their rights. Secondly, we have a specific social aspect. Of course, we all want an inclusive, tolerant, and democratic society, but this is not enough, because we have to help our patients develop a sense of confidence in their peers. And then we also have to work very rigorously. We also have to use our clinical tools very rigorously. And this is made possible by the staff meeting supervisions. These are fundamental elements for our life. And then we always network with our partners. We try to raise awareness among our public, and also we try to organize joint training sessions with our partners. And what, in my view, is the most important element, which is always very difficult to carry out, is to avoid to be seen as an expert. I mean, we do not, I mean, we know that we have the knowledge, we have the experience, but rather we have to give our patients the possibility to speak. So, of course, we also organize moments of sharing, moments of reflection. There will also be some next year, and we will organize these moments to give the possibility to patients to speak so that they can share what they learned about themselves, about their needs. This will be fundamental, and also to make us understand what our services can do. I also talked to you about individual psychiatrists. And after 5 or 6 years after Ulysses was launched, we would have had the time to set up teams, especially to receive constant funds. However, these projects our project simply received some funds, and we focus not only on clinical practice, but also on the community dimension. This is one of the main features of our work. And we also selected some colleagues and collaborators among our former patients. We also hired, let's say, the most appropriate figures, and we tried not to include those who seemed too fragile, too vulnerable, because we wanted to start to promote these community activities to our patients, to the patients who were already more stable, who were already stronger, those who showed that they had already developed a community dimension. Unfortunately, this has not been the case yet. So the greatest lesson that we learned was the need to let go of certain criteria, certain indications, and we were really surprised by certain situations. For instance, there were two different situations that really surprised us. But we tried always to focus on the logic of institutional therapy. So we organized 2 yearly festivals, one in the winter and one in the summer. At first, we did that to present the various activities and relaunch a sort of dynamic among the patients. And the patients really took hold of these events, and they decided to organize these events on a yearly basis. Well, people live in extreme uncertainty, and this often leads to complete social isolation. They suffer psychologically because they lived some traumas in the past. And therefore, they wanted to establish new connections, new relationships, but this is often difficult. Often they have no points of reference. And I would like to make a short, brief summary of the various community activities that we develop. Since 2010, Ulysses has been offering a series of projects twice a year, and we follow an interactive methodology that is focused on creativity and on a human approach, and we call it Arcada. And these workshops aim to enable each participant to refocus on his or her personal resources in order to give new impetus to their migration projects and situation of exile in Belgium. So we prepared these workshops that are open to all. Anyone can participate, and they are basically free of charge. And we try to involve vulnerable people. Vulnerability, in fact, is one of the principles that we wanted to try to address, because vulnerability is something that excludes rather than include, and community activities include these Arcada sessions. We also have this journal. This is one of our issues, and this is produced jointly, and it is called the Papyrus à l'horizon. And then some points of reference. These are some points of reference. Well, at first, we decided to publish this journal to help patients understand what was going on, let's say. But then our patients told us that they wanted to somehow discover new dimensions. So we decided to develop new activities to give them the possibility to discover new interests that they could also cultivate outside our institution. So we give them the possibility to find, let's say, experiences outside of our center. And this also helped them to work with the others, with other realities. And then we also decided to develop other groups, some targeted groups. We have the first one called Le Jardin des Femmes. It is a group for women only, and it was opened after we realized that many women were at home, they were stuck at home, they didn't carry out any activity at all. So we thought that it was important for us to give them time or create a space, a community space outside of their house. And then we also opened a youth space, a teenagers clinic. And this also obliged us to somehow change our framework and reverse the our logic. So we proposed that people could enroll in Ulysses passing through the community. So while patients and adults come through, but they're referred to us, for teenagers, we decided to do something different. That is, we gave them the possibility to join ULIS through the activities, even before they had to answer questions or they had to go through our interview. At the beginning, we proposed let's say, we somehow proposed the idea of having a person in charge of every young person, but this was not something that was accepted by teenagers. Anyway, we had many teenagers that took part in our activities, and they decided to make this transition they decided to join us more freely. And then we developed an activity that is called La Boîte à Tartines, which is a parenting space. It is something that we propose to families who have some parental difficulties. So the family has difficulties with the children, and in this way we give the possibility to families to have support for their parenting skills. This is a space in which children can meet, where they can share, and also parents can do that. So this space was created to offer a breathing space. It is also a space in which parents can be supported. It is a space in which children and parents can play freely. It is not a space for psychotherapy. And then we have individual activities, but I would like to go back to talking about networking. Networking is fundamental. In 2007, we created a network of mental health in exile. And it is our local health unit that created that. And it is something that we developed with our partners, and we work together with our partners in order to raise awareness among the public so that they can become aware of some psychological fragilities. Now, this network produces a guide, mental health in exiled persons. This was republished in 2008. And then we also have workshops that we organize on the theme of mental health. And also, we asked psychological interviews to be also included on the form for the mental asylum application. Now, we also have a coordination that is focused on exile and mental health that can provide information to exiles. And this is a network that has a working group made up of psychiatrists, psychologists, legal supports, interpreters, and also city movements. I do not know if I still have some time. Dr. Branker, I apologize. You have 2 minutes to conclude your presentation. Very well. So I would like to continue with the AIDA project, which is a space for mothers in exile. So exile as a space of life before the birth of a child. Now, this project also proposes medical checks for the mother before the birth, and then also for the child up to for children younger than 3 months of age. We also have a training center that offers several training opportunities for our partners. Because the sector we work in requires a specific training. We offer training centers or training opportunities also to the people who work in the centers that welcome exiles and migrants. I think that I have given you a whole description of the activities that ULIS has developed in the various fields. These are activities that have grown over the course of the years. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brancher. Thank you for this wonderful contribution. Thank you for presenting the idea, the experience of ULIS. This is a very representative experience, especially because you work so hard on integration. I do not know whether you will be able to stay with us, so I will leave the floor, first of all, to Roberto Beneduce, Professor Roberto Beneduce, and then I will open a question and answer session after we have the next speakers. So I already presented Roberto Beneduce. We started to work together. Let me, I will leave him the floor immediately. Now, the theme of his presentation is subjectivity, organization, and the various factors that these aspects of subjectivity compromise. So the role of psychiatry vis-à-vis asylum seekers.
Grazie.
Grazie Giulio. Sorry for speaking Italian.
Thanks, Giulio. Sorry for speaking Italian, but after 6 hours, I'm not able to continue in English.
You have need of more explanation. I can translate in French or in English, but forgive me, I need to speak Italian now. Grazie Giulio.
Comunque abbiamo la traduzione simultanea e quindi...
Yes, we have the interpreters, so no worries. Thank you. It's in French and in English, so you can go on in Italian. Thank you. This is reassuring me. So I was listening to the Ligue bruxelloise pour la santé mentale. In the past, I had friends and colleagues with whom we worked in Senegal, so I'm particularly pleased to be here with them. Well, I start with a preamble. Especially for those who do not know me, I want to spend a few words on the perspective that is at the basis of my considerations. About 30 or 28 years ago in Turin, we first launched the Frantz Fanon Center. This experience aimed at hosting migrants and asylum seekers, refugees, victims of torture. And our team has been working to set up a model that, on the one hand, was not meant to be a closed environment. Sorry.
No,
There are some audio issues. We can perfectly hear you, so I don't know what happened. Anyway, participant can set the Italian channel. Please, you can go on. Thank you. So I was saying that it's important to define the position, the perspective on which we base our intervention. I was underlining that The experience of the Fanon Center in Turin was started at mid-90s. In these years, we have been following migrants and asylum seekers, victims of torture in many countries, and we didn't want to have two challenges. On the one hand, we avoided being limited in the barriers of cultural belongings. Since the very beginning, we have been working on these challenges that were related to the presence of other cultural structures, which were extremely important for us. Another barrier we had, and we wanted to prevent, is some theoretical models and diagnostic and therapeutic practices that were hindering us. Now I don't want to go into the detail. These were the practices that were found in a recent work, translated also into Italian by EDFSN and Richard Riechnemann, The Empire of Trauma. This has started a whole set of PTSD diagnoses and practices as the IMDR applied too massively to all the asylum seekers with no distinction at all, no diversification, neglecting an aspect which instead I would like to focus on that was very important to us. That is the accountability of institutions in amplifying or even in generating sufferance among those who already have in their stories already gathered scars, uncertainties of any kind. So these three elements guided us and frame my presentation. First of all, how to make cultural belonging an important aspect without being seduced or overwhelmed by this dimension. We thought it was necessary to be equipped with a technique that might sound trivial, but is still struggling to be included in the heritage of healthcare institutions, healthcare services for mental health in Italy. That is mediation, cultural, ethno-clinical mediation as an asset that doesn't simply mean translating from a language into another. It might sound trivial, but this is instead revealing a big gap. We pretend to diagnose and treat and understand the suffering, the complex suffering of our interlocutors, ignoring largely symbolic, geopolitical, religious, and language dimensions. And when we ultimately use this resource, we do it in a bad way because we ask interpreters or operators to translate without understanding that the territory of the language is by itself a territory that has to be questioned and understood, because language itself and the language of our interlocutor is often distorted by the experience of violence and torture. For the sake of time, I simply make some evocations to make my speech more comprehensible. Those who work with torture victims identify an important characteristic in the experience of the survivors, that is, ordinary language has been transformed, manipulated by the torturers, and this language becomes useless. The ordinary language is by itself a vehicle of perpetration or reproduction of the very traumatic experience. So our task is to recognize that simply by putting the other in the condition of speaking in his or her language can sometimes or often even be paradoxically a traumatic effect, because that language does not belong to this person any longer. It's been depossessed of this. So we need to ask ourselves how to make language and cultural belonging a useful leverage in those who come from contexts where language and culture have become themselves the theaters of perversion, abuse. So it's a big challenge that the classical ethnopsychiatry provided just a partial answer, and the other models that prevail in trauma psychotherapy, despite there are experiences and tools, these models have not offered yet that analysis that is instead urgently needed. So we have to imagine a clinical practice or a technique that would get closer to the language of that person, the culture of that person, without underestimating these aspects, so that this ambivalent relation that the person has established with his or her language or sounds should instead become a therapeutic leverage to transform memories, traumatic memories that are prevailing in the persons. So the protagonists are mediators, cultural mediators, who have to be conceived since the very beginning as experts to be trained, not as natural experts. We have to humbly recognize that in Italy, often we use persons who know local languages of our users or our clients without working beforehand on the impact on these people of the prolonged relationship with those memories, those theaters of violence and torture. So these mediators were asked to translate without even knowing the potential impact on these people. And so this issue has been well known for us for the conflictual relationship that is generated between mediators and asylum seekers in the moment in which they meet at the table of the commissions for the recognition of humanitarian international protection. In this context, very often the experience of asylum seekers is that they felt betrayed by the mediators, that the translation to them was not efficient. There's an incredible lack of trust that is generated precisely in the place and starting from that instrument that we thought was capable of streamlining communication and making the reasons for their search for help understandable. For some years now, I've been wondering on another equally important aspect, that is, when among the applications for international protection, asylum seekers table at the tables of human rights in Europe, not only or simply religious persecutions or the more usual threats we have been witnessing since the after-war period when these listening techniques were first established. Instead, they table on the tables of human rights, mystical nature threats, and our imagination is not familiar to that. Religious sects, the need to escape, to abandon certain roles that have been attached to them from the village people after the death of the parents. And if we think about it, we were not prepared. So we had to create the possibility to offer a listening to these, so to say, cultural beliefs, metaphors, superstitions, witchcraft, but I mean, not in Africa or in those areas where we are used at knowing how shamans work, but here in Europe, at the court of Lake, Elisabeth Clavière, in an article of 2018 published on Les Cahiers d'études africaines, noticed that all of a sudden, when the judge said to the interlocutors from Congo to better explain the reasons of these threats, the constraints of secret he was referring to, suddenly a judge of the European Court stood up and asked to give up forcing that person because these threats were serious, and the threats this person was referring to can have a real dramatic impact on the life and health of this person. And this judge was a Malian judge. So I would like to let you think for an instant to the interrelation of reasons that we thought were stopped and are now resumed on the tables of human rights, forcing us to stop and wonder on the need to rethink suitably this melting of cultural elements, rights and political elements that we had thought as separated for too long. The second consideration, I said at the beginning that we need to give up the hegemonic aspects of psychiatry related to trauma and trauma-related suffering. I was referring to the fact that since the 90s or the end of the 90s, with the crisis of the migratory traditional dynamics, the coming in Europe, as we know, has dropped massively. And the only way to come into Europe has been for a long time the asylum application. This started as a consequence, a process that on the one hand induced the diffusion of a suspect of the authenticity and veridicity of the statements provided in the territorial commissions. On the other side, a collapse of the admissions to the asylum seekers. In the past years, for example, in France, in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, it accounted only for 16 or 18% of asylum seekers who were admitted. This generated, as you might easily understand, another process, an incredible mass of suspended people, the very last ones who were kept in this process that in the literature is called waiting or uncertainty, that produced as a iatrogenic factor, a further suffering that was generated by our laws, by our procedures. Another aspect that I wanted to refer to, and again, as you might imagine, it's incredibly complex, is that we ended up using often as a workaround the psychiatric PTSD diagnosis, which for many has become the only way to have the suffering being recognized. So this massively used diagnosis, this improperly used diagnosis, there were two other consequences. On the one hand, the very meaning of the request of asylum's rights was medicalized with reasons of another nature. So we imposed a medical psychiatric grid on what up to then was always conceived as a narration, as a right of a political nature. This aspect has been explored in a detailed way by many authors, and they highlighted how in the period in which this process, so to say, worked, is the beginning of the year 2000, the PTSD diagnosis had a proliferation, an unprecedented proliferation, forgetting the limits of the initial use of this category that today has become a sort of diagnostic panacea that runs the risk of becoming like the personality disorder, the generic container that is deprived of any meaning of sufferance. And the other consequence is related to the cultural profile that I've been evoking. The imposition of the PTSD model has eradicated all differences. The language of trauma, suffering, or mourning were, so to say, compressed in a single predominant vocabulary. Those who want to think according to the local context, the historical and cultural context, other different tracks of suffering, mourning, and trauma can no longer do that because we are forced to impose this lexicon, because that's the only terminology that would make the suffering of asylum seekers authentic and recognizable. And the third profile as well is that once these applications became increased more and more, and Europe was increasingly closed, I was referring to the logic of suspicion, probably without being aware, we have reproduced the logic of suspicion that for a long time characterized the colonial approach. Migrant was by definition a suspect in the 50s or 60s. The works by Fanon and then Benani have always suggested us how the pain, the suffering of the foreigner were not satisfied with a natural answer. Often it was thought that this person would be faking Le Syndrome Nord-Africain, or the book Benani, Le Corps Suspect, tell us that there is a historical trajectory that has always frozen the other in that framework of a suspected person, whose identity is not worth enough. Over the years, asylum seekers have become somebody whose word is not worth, to the point of developing instruments, language instruments that are sophisticated to recognize if this person is lying or not. As for the geographical trajectory that determined the escape in Europe, the country of origin, maybe you know what has become an instrument that is often used in Great Britain or other countries, LADO, Linguistic Analysis for the Determination of Origin.
Una vera e propria griglia di domande incrociate, di test.
A language grid of questions and tests that the other has to accept to demonstrate and to transform his story into a credible story so that the application is met. So the other has become a subject who, in an invisible way, passed from the position of being someone to be helped to the role of a person who has to demonstrate that it is true what he or she is saying, that it is authentic. So a very subtle shift that has changed this meeting from the asylum seekers and the hosting countries. Can you be short in 3 minutes? Yes, I will try. So the reasons for this suspect are clearly evident, and I'm the first to tell this, that some asylum seekers can also lie, but we need to be immediately honest with ourselves and recognize that these little lies of asylum seekers cannot be absolutely compared with the big perverse lies of European laws and European Western governments of the violence of their institutions. Like me, you can remember the pictures of what happened, the images of at the borders from Mexico and the US when children were taken from the arms of their parents or adults accompanying them, letting them cry and traumatizing them. So faced with these images of violence, we can think that these little lies of our asylum seekers are really nothing, are simply trivial. Just think that some days ago in Italy, political members dared to say, by ignorance and arrogance or perversion, that Ukraine could become, for new migrants, the channel to reach European countries or Italy, just like as if an African person would move from the Ivory Coast to Ukraine to get more easily into Europe. Faced with the violence of these statements, the little lies of foreigners instead have the value of a finger pointed against the hypocrisy and the violence of our words. And I would like to conclude, there are many authors who questioned the state of objection that our laws continue to reproduce. Shram Khosravi, the Iranian anthropologist, who wrote incredibly rich pages, articles like Stolen Time, that remind us to what extent the violence of a state can arrive. Khosravi remembers a family that after 27 years from Norway had to leave their country because they declared 27 years before of being Jordan instead of Palestine. So we have an urgent need as clinicians, as psychiatrists, to recognize these forms of violence, to trace the political phenomenology of the suffering of asylum seekers that should not forget our silences and our delays. I would like to remind an incredible trend that we are following. The number of suicides in administrative detention camps of very young persons who, in the lack of listening of their frailties, they decided to commit suicide in centers that have been declared illegal by many organisms which defend human rights. A person is deprived of freedom with no reason, and in these detention camps, this person who commits suicide, that is the j'accuse, the most severe accusation, and psychiatry, psychology, and clinics shall not allow all this. Thank you. This is the first, the first presentation today was talking about these problems, the Australian presentation. And I think that your recall to what happens in our European countries is equally important and should engage all of us. I was thinking out the fact that in the canonic right, there is a way in which the poor people stealing something were acquitted. The occulto compensatio was a sort of revolt of the weak to the violence of the strong. And I think that this little lie is recalling of this occulto compensatio, the strong that forces the weakest to these little lies. So thank you again. I've seen lots of congratulations on the chat. So now we move to the last presentation of the day. Let me thank Mariam Schuler Ochak. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Also for the patience of being with us up to now.
Della sezione della World Psychiatric Association in Transcultural Psychiatry con sede a Berlino.
So you're in Berlin and you're talking about the consequences of forced displacement. Thank you so much for being with us. Leave you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also inviting me to this very important international seminar. I'm happy to be here and share my presentation on mental health consequences of forced displacement. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I'm professor for intercultural psychiatry. This is a very unique professorship. It's we have only one in Germany. And I'm also the chair of transcultural psychiatry section of WPA. And I think this is also a very important issue to be connected maybe later with you in our section. So I hope you can see my slides.
Yeah, perfect. Okay.
First of all, I would like to, give some information on statistics, then move on with people on the move and get back to refugees in Europe, mental health issues of these displaced people, and give also some information on risk factors, but also on asylum applications, risk factors regarding migration, during the migration, after the migration, and then give also some information on COVID-19 and forcibly displaced people or international migrants. and conclude my presentation. First of all, if you have a look to the statistic regarding forcibly displaced people worldwide, we had by the end of 2020 more than 82.4 million people on the way, and 48 million of these forcibly displaced people were internally displaced, and more than 20 million were refugees and others were asylum seekers and so on. Looking to the parts, where are these people coming from and in which countries are they hosted? First of all, it is striking that only 14% of all these forcibly displaced people were able to, by the end of 2020, to arrive in a so-called developed country, but 86% of all these forcibly displaced people were hosted in developing countries. And the most hosting countries were Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany. And the major source countries were, as you know, also Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar. And nowadays, we know the war in Ukraine, we will have a lot of refugees also from Ukraine. Now in Berlin, we have received more than 20,000 in a few days. So the ways are also well known. I share this slide with you because the Mediterranean Sea is one of the biggest places where a lot of people died, and we do not have the real data on these people. And therefore, I think it's good to remember all these pictures which go through all media channels and have again remembering of all these people who were struggling for their lives. Another photo. I think this picture was very virulent, so it was touching a lot of people, so me too. And we know that not only males who wanted to work in, I don't know where else, in Europe or other parts, but also families, women and children lost their lives during the passage through the Mediterranean Sea. And these are, for example, deaths by routes. You can see that all parts of the Mediterranean Sea was used crossing to Europe, and you can see that in the first 2014, 15, 16, the most way was the central Mediterranean part, but later it changed more and more to the Western Mediterranean part, and you can see that in all parts people lost their lives. Mostly these people were from different parts of Africa, but the most part of them were from Africa. For example, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and South Asia, also from Middle East and South Asia. But the main population was coming from African parts. And we know that there are a lot of risk factors or a lot of events which these people experience during their migration, but before the migration or flight, for example, exposure to war and other factors. I will get back to this part later, but also during the migration and after the migration. So, for example, looking to the types of pre-migration traumatic events, for example, listed here, confined to home, murder or death of family, witness briefing or witness killing or beatings or torture or lack of shelter, or there are really a lot of events which have huge impact on mental health issues or conditions of these people on the way or forcibly displaced people. In a study which we did in Germany 2016, we have interviewed more than 280 female refugees from different parts of the world, for example, Afghanistan, Somalia, Eritrea, and so on. We asked these females for life events during the flight, and we asked them if they were self-experiencing these events and if they were eyewitness or if they heard of these events, and we could collect these data. And the striking issue is that these females had experienced a lot of traumatizing events, were also eyewitness to other events or similar events, or have heard about these events. That means that they were really in a huge burden and had very, very bad mental health conditions at that time. And these interviews were conducted in their mother languages with female scientific staff. Also, after the migration process, if they arrive in a so-called safe place, they had also some factors or difficulties which go on to impacting their mental health conditions, so-called post-migration difficulties. For example, of course, separation from family, various family at home, or unable to find a work or an employment, or to find a social network. They are mostly also isolated, they are lonely, or they experience different kinds of discrimination, racistic attacks and other issues, and as well as to difficulties in immigration officials. And all these factors are risk factors, and these have together huge impact on their health conditions, not only on their mental health, but also somatic health conditions. So thus we know that people on the move, or forcibly displaced people on the move, nearly 60% of them live in cities or as camps, are very nearby the cities, or so-called camp-like shelters and so on. So these conditions are really precarious for these people, and they are mostly faced with other kinds of violations, for example, gender-wise violations, or other misuses or human trafficking issues regarding also works and so on. So they are without any kind of support or legal services in some parts in these shelters. And looking to their mental health conditions of these refugees or other displaced people, we all know, we had seen before some data, a huge burden of mental disorders, of course, including post-traumatic stress disorders, depression, idioms of distress, or prolonged grief disorders, or other load of traumatic circumstances which are influencing them, and so on. And a lot of them are really traumatized and suffer from a variety of different symptoms, and only very few of them seek help or support. Looking to also some systematic reviews, for example, 2018, Lindart and colleagues did a systematic review in which they included 1,877 studies, and only 15 studies were included with refugees from African countries, for example, and others included refugees from Asia or from other parts of the world. But what I would like to share with you is the prevalent rates of PTSD, which varied between 5 and 71%. Mean prevalence rate was at 32%, and regarding PTS and regarding depression, 35%. Of course, these prevalences depend on the countries of origin, and in countries where human rights violations are very huge, the prevalence rates are accordingly also high. Another publication which I would like to share with you is the fact that the post-migratory factors, compromising items, for example, associated with isolation, restrictive policies, or stressors associated with having an insecure immigrant status, was significantly associated with PTSD scores. We know also from publications from Kees Laban, the former chair of the Transcultural Psychiatry section from WPA, did 2004, 5, and 6 really very good research with refugees from Iraq, and he found at that time that the mental health burden or disorders depend on the stay in these shelters, in these collective housings. And and from the duration of asylum applications. So if these applications were in a long period, it correlated with the fairness of the mental health conditions of these people. So if we could succeed to deal with other conditions of living for these people and to succeed to integrate them in our social networks, in our social world, as well as in our employment world, labor market, and so on, we could expect that the integration processes are much better and the mental health conditions will get also much better. And another publication which is very important is also, it is done in Australia, and it is on an analysis of the first phase of the longitudinal study of humanitarian migrants in Australia to assess the association between social integration and self-related health. The colleagues reported that impressively this study showed that post-migratory stressors such as lack of integration, employment, but also educational opportunities, family separations, or lack of social network, and so on, contribute to the development trauma sequelae. So these post-migratory risk factors are with a huge impact or influence to the mental health situation of these forcibly displaced people. Another information which I would like to share with you is the number of asylum applications in Europe, 2008 to 2020. We can see that the number of these applications was very huge, increased a lot in 2013, 2014, but 2015, and of course 16, and then it went down. So this is therefore important because we have a huge number of applications, but at the same time, if you can see here, the final decision of these applications, these are outcomes 2020, you can see the red ones are rejected ones, final rejected. That means that the most of these applications are rejected. And I do not know what is going on with all these people because they are still in insecure conditions and they are not accepted as asylum seekers, and they are still in an irregular, I don't know what kind of conditions. So this is a huge impact factor for their mental health disorders too. For example, if we have a look to the main data from Europe, nearly 70% of all applications were rejected in average in Europe. Only 10% received humanitarian reasons, 10% had subsidiary protections, and 10% were accepted as refugees or received refugee status where applications were accepted. So it is, I think, very interesting data and to be taken into consideration in our considerations in our planning too. Another issue which I would like to share with you is also the situation within the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that there are precarious conditions in some housings, in some shelters, or in other precarious situations in labor markets and so on. We know that immigrants, refugees, ethnic minorities, and forcibly displaced people are much more working in systematic, relevant employment situations in front lines, where in cleaning job markets and so on, where the possibilities to get support where can be much more infected by the virus. So there are three possible explanations distinguished in a study. This study was on data from a big insurance company in Germany, which was in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in the first wave. This company collected data from 1.2 million patients, and in this publication, it was reported that the part of people who were infected or who died in the first wave of COVID-19 pandemic were elderly ones, of course, but natives as well as others. And they find out that the socio-economically bad suited people or people living in poorer districts of cities were much more involved in these infections, and also they died much more in comparison to others. And in this publication, empirical evidence for social inequalities in COVID-19 for migrants and forcibly displaced people were underlined. And three of these explanations are, as mentioned before, distinguished. First was inequalities in exposure. As mentioned before, socioeconomically disadvantaged populations more likely to work in occupations where the likelihood of coming into contact with the virus is increased. And secondly, similarities. People with higher incomes are comparatively more likely to have the option to protect home-based works. So there are also some results which show that people with migration background or refugee background do not have the possibility to work at home in home offices or something like that. So they are not working in such levels so that they can realize home offices. In addition, people with lower incomes are more likely to live in unfavorable housing conditions. So, for example, cramped flats with higher risk of infection and possible exposure on, for example, public transportations. So this is a very important point, inequalities in exposure. The second point is inequalities in vulnerability. As mentioned before, these people have pre-existing diseases or mental disorders, for example, PTSD, depression, or other issues, or smoking, or substance abuses, and so on. So due to existing health inequalities, socioeconomically disadvantaged population groups are already more frequently affected by pre-existing diseases and other risk factors because they have other levels of mental health conditions before the pandemic starts. And another issue is that this condition makes them more susceptible to infections when exposed, and the event of an infection, they have a higher risk of severe disease progression. Another fact is that recent studies also emphasize the role of environmental pollution. So, for example, increased pollution in poorer neighborhoods and its impact on pre-existing health conditions. So they are also living in poorer neighborhoods with higher pollution exposures. So the second point is very important, inequalities in vulnerability. The first is inequalities in healthcare. This is mentioned before. A lot of people do not have this good access to mental health care systems in different parts of Europe, so or over the world. These people face a lot of barriers. In this case, I would like to underline also structural racism or other kinds of discrimination. So lack of, for example, interpreters, lack of cultural competencies, lack of the possibility of intercultural communication, or lack of knowledge on explanations of diseases in these populations, or lack of knowledge on idioms of distress, or lack of knowledge on expectations of these people, and so on. There is a lot of possibilities for barriers, and we are not aware always to all these barriers. And the other issue is rather testing opportunities for this population and vaccination possibilities. So I will get back later to vaccination possibilities and a possibly delayed utilization in the case of an infection, sometimes because of irregularities or sometimes because of other restrictions.
Professor, can you stay in 5 minutes?
Yes, of course. I will be ready in 5 minutes, of course.
Okay, good. Thank you so much.
Yes, this is, I think, very important regarding the vaccination. we have found in Germany by a study of Robert Koch Institute, which is a public institution which advises the government that the language abilities or the campaigns which were done regarding vaccinations, also testing and so on, were not culture sensitive and culture sensible. So they do not reach these target groups, these disadvantaged groups. I think this would be very good to know it. The readiness to be vaccinated in these groups are not less in comparison to the natives. It was reported that their readiness or preparedness to be vaccinated is much higher in comparison to natives. Now, I would like to go on and up my presentation with reminding the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. This is very interesting because it is outlined there that the notion of universal rights or to access healthcare, stating everyone has the right of access to preventive healthcare and the right to benefit from medical treatment under the conditions established by national laws and practices. And a high level of human health protection shall be ensured in the definition and implementation of all union policies and activities. And please remind, these people are have also the right for medical health care. And my last slide is to cite the health definition from WHO from 1948, where is written a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Health is a resource for everyday life, not the objective of living, and it is a fundamental human right recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie veramente per questo.
Thank you very much for reminding us of the European Charter of Human, that unfortunately of rights, of universal rights, that unfortunately are not often recognized to migrants. And also thank you for presenting the risk factors, also those connected to the pandemic, to the COVID-19 pandemic, because at times these are forgotten. However, I read that there is a question by Letizia Caiati. So let us give her the possibility to ask the question, and then we will move towards the conclusion. Mrs. Caiati, over to you. I can see that Mrs. Caiati raised her hand, or was that a mistake? No. So probably that was a mistake. We cannot hear you. All right, well, never mind. So if there are no questions, I do not know whether someone else has questions. I have seen that Roberto Beneducci unfortunately had to leave us. Yes, Roberto had to start another meeting. So he said hello to everyone and he wishes to thank all of you. But unfortunately, he had to leave us because he had another meeting. All right, Julia, so I think that as it is nearly 6 o'clock and as these 3 hours have been very dense without pause, I think that we can thank all the speakers. I think that the session was very well structured. We had many different voices who gave a very broad, wide-ranging perspective on the theme of mental health and forced migrants. So I wish to thank all of you. If you allow me, I would simply like to add one thing. We completed the certain procedures, the evaluation of the psychopathology in a specific part of southern Italy. where there are many migrants, many forced migrants. But I think that this international perspective and the experiences that we heard push us to continue to work and to continue to collaborate with the local health unit of the region and Campania and the IPRS. I would also like to say that our local health unit also included vulnerability in our area of competence. But I hope that together with all the speakers, we will be able to continue discussing not only to talk about this theme, but also for future collaborations. So I do not know, maybe Raffaele, we might come up with something, we might, I don't know, start international collaborations, because I think that the experiences that we heard today, for instance, the French experience, the German experience, I mean, we have a great opportunity to develop something together. What do you think? I absolutely agree with you. Also, because I think well, yes, we are trying to address many similar problems, many complex problems. We have to deal with refugees, with asylum seekers, and the psychiatric services really find it hard, really struggle to identify the type of suffering that they have, but also to try and find an answer to this. At the same time, as Roberto Beneduce said, there is a lack of cultural mediators. And then also the challenge posed by the living conditions of forced migrants. So I think that these are conditions that we share with the rest of Europe. So I think that we should find a common response to these complexities. And I think that we should try and find common solutions. Maybe we could start to develop some collaboration, some research work, some joint research work. Giulio, what do you think? Well, yes, I would like to thank everyone. I hope that we will start to do something with the Institute, the local health unit of the region Campania. And I really do hope that we will manage to collaborate. So I wish to thank, Professor Schuller-Ojak wanted to say something.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And my message goes out especially to you after listening all the considerations that you shared.
Prego,
yeah.
Dottoressa.
As I told in the beginning, I'm the chair of the Transcultural Psychiatry section of WPA. So this could be also a platform where you could be a member and we can share knowledges, experiences, best practice models, and other or research projects or ideas and so on. So thus I would like to invite you to join our section and to do something together with us, or it's also a very great possibility to have a network with similar thinking or experts in your field and so on. So please join our section. You are very welcome.
Grazie veramente per l'invito.
Thank you. And if you allow me, because to say this, we are interested in planning some shared initiatives, Professor, which means that, I mean, we might start to work something together. We might start to plan together, if you agree, Professor Schuller-Ojak.
Yes, we can do it. You're very welcome, and I would like to support you if you need any support.
Allora, grazie, Professor
Very
Schaeffer.
well. Thank you, Professor Schaeffer. Thank you, Mr. Brancard. Thank you, Professor Schuler-Ojak. I hope I did not mispronounce your name. Oh, I pronounced it Okak. No.
It's pronounced Ojak. Schuler.
Ojak. Professor Nerima Schuler-Ojak.
Very well, Professor Schuler-Ojak. So I wish to thank Roberta Beneduce, who had to leave us, but I can say that there are many people who are thanking him in the chat. I also wish to thank our Australian friends, and I wish to thank all of the participants, over 120 people. It has really been a pleasure to see that this theme is very interesting. Very well. So some of you already reminded you that we are always watching the news to see what happens in Ukraine. So every now and again, there seems to be some beacon of hope. Let's hope so. Well, thank you very much and see you soon.